the very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is the whole state of things, pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins, as always sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce today's discussion, we just want to mention briefly that we do have a Patreon account at patreon.com/MUHH. Consider maybe tossing us $1 a month there. Today, Taylor and I will be diving into Hegel's Philosophy of Right. What's the full title?
It's been variously translated as Elements of the Philosophy of Right or Outlines of the Philosophy of Right. Originally translated, well, I think the standard translation is T.M. Knox, but, Cambridge has been redoing all the translations, and the one that I sent you was by Nisbet, edited by Alan Wood, who's one at Cambridge. He's a big Hegel scholar. There's a lot of them. The good thing about the Oxford translation, which I also sent you, is that it's got a really nice introduction by Stephen Holgate, who you really enjoyed when we had him on.
Wonderful. I didn't get a chance to read that, sadly. The introduction was a lot longer than I had thought it was.
Well, no, I just meant just for background.
Just like the Philosophy of Right thing. It would have been good, I'm sure.
I would say, before we jump in, because I do want to get your takes, at least on how you felt reading him. I do think that the preface puts into context briefly, sort of, if you will, first of all, like what philosophy's task is. And I think that the best way to describe why Hegel is wanting to talk about what the task of philosophy is, specifically when it talks about right, politics, if you will, right?
Yeah. Right.
Because the end of the preface, if you will, the preface has some kind of famous bangers in it, one of which he recapitulates the real, or sometimes translated the actual, is rational and the rational is actual, right? And he ends, I think the penultimate paragraph in the preface is, philosophy comes too late to say how things ought to be, right? It paints its gray on gray, the owl of Minerva takes flight at dusk. So philosophy is always this kind of retrospective. Anyway, I guess I wanted to, and I believe that same image is found in the Phenomenology, which was written, I think, 13 years earlier. So this is kind of towards the end of Hegel's life. I think he died. I think this is like 1820-ish, or maybe that's when the lectures are. This is the last decade of his life. But anyway, The task of philosophy for Hegel is to develop the concept into the idea, right? To show it how the concept already has in it all of the things that can concretize it and actualize it, all these determinate moments. It has to unfold into the idea. And that alone doesn't really mean much to us, except to say that he's writing against a lot of kind of, if you will, populist thinkers who want to reflect on the historical events of the time. If you're thinking he's writing in the wake of some political reform in Prussia and the backlash to that, right? Which is why sometimes he's been heralded as like an agent of the Prussian state, which Holgate shows why that's not really fair. Even if he's not a fucking, revolutionary, he's more on the side of reform than on the side of restoration. In any case, he's also writing in the wake of, as we know from the Phenomenology, of the French Revolution, Napoleon, the Terror, and he's mainly concerned with how what he sees philosophy in the kind of base or debased sense, it's appealing to feeling and opinion and enthusiasm, is kind of Schwärmerei, is what Kant talks about, right? It's appealing to all the things that philosophy since Plato has really fought against. You know what I mean? So there is this kind of return to tradition, to the tradition of philosophy in Hegel's preface. And then I think the intro is really the kind of metaphysics of freedom. So it gives a kind of, in broad strokes, it paints the picture of this sort of interaction between subjective spirit and objective spirit. It gives a dirty rundown of what freedom in the abstract sense, in the metaphysical sense, is. And that's really kind of to remind us, because I think Hegel does presuppose that we have familiarity with like his Science of Logic or his Encyclopedia Logic, where he discusses sort of the dialectic of freedom. But he tries to give us a little lowdown on what the metaphysics of freedom and the free will is, so that then we can begin with abstract right, which is what I suppose it's 3 parts in the philosophy of right, and we focused on the first part. If you skip the preface and intro of Hegel's work, don't worry, you probably saved yourself a little bit of a headache, but I do think that it's a exercise in kind of training oneself to like think in through the Hegelian logical wordsmithing and phraseology. It's, it's not pretty writing, but it is a style. You can't say that Hegel doesn't have a style. I may not like the style, but I do think that it prepares us a little bit for some of the terminology. But the fact that you skipped it, I don't think is absolutely a detriment. It's again, you saved yourself some time and maybe some headache, but it's still good to eat your vegetables, as they say. And I'll step back now and let you like reflect on your thoughts on what we read for today.
I didn't skip the entire intro, but
Okay.
So I finished the preface. I was maybe, I don't even know, maybe halfway through the intro, and then I was starting to realize, oh shit, this is a lot longer, and I need to like skip this so I can finish the fucking chapter.
That's you made a good choice. I think that's a strategic choice. So you understood what I meant in the preface when I mentioned he kind of he's worried that philosophy is going to lapse into these kind of ad hoc justifications by pointing to particular feelings or opinions of the day. Again, I mean, like one of the things that he's looking at, and I think Stephen Holgate tells us about this, but this is really quick. He, in the context, there's like a political assassination, say a minister is killed. I forget exactly who. And then there are these private letters exchanged by somebody either in the government, or maybe he was a professor. I think it was a professor. I have to look back. Anyway, these letters were made public, and in the letters, he's kind of justifying or even exulting in this political assassination. And there is this kind of push back to, first of all, like remove him from office, but also this pushback that, hey, people kind of wanted this assassination because of some of the turmoil going on around the restoration and certain considerations of value. And eventually, so the whole thing that Holgate sums this up, and I paraphrase it really badly, but the whole point being, in the midst of the political reality of the day, Hegel is seeing how there is a kind of, I don't want to say mob mentality, but there is a kind of ad hoc justification of political violence not based on reason, but based on, well, it sure felt good that this XYZ representative of the opposition was killed. I'm sure there's nothing in the past few weeks that we can't think of, that Hegel might poo-poo all the people like fantasizing about Trump's assassination attempt. I think Hegel would say, like, look, let's settle down, let's think about this rationally, guys. Let's develop the concept in and for itself. The concept doesn't care about your feelings. That's the preface, right? The philosophy doesn't care about your feelings, and therefore, like, any attempt to talk about right, the capital R, which all German nouns are capitalized, but let's say in English in a capital R, any attempt to talk about right based on feelings and therefore on opinion in that wider sense of if something feels good, so it should be or is right. Hegel's going to push back against that. And he even names one of the philosophers he's looking at, like a prominent anti-Semite of the time named Fries, who is kind of elaborating a political philosophy based on feelings. Almost like you can imagine today's like, let's take polls, and based on polls, that will become the current law. Now, I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with certain every 4 years, you might put up certain laws for voting for or against. But if every law had to shift with like polling, I think that would be something a little chaotic. And I think that that would be irrational in Hegel's sense, right? We can't lapse into that type of understanding of right, because woe to the people who are not currently in power.
I'm going to fuck you up real bad here and just say that your example of the Trump assassination goes to the idea of the vigilante who would not have the right, from Hegel's position, would not have the right despite whatever justifications, even rational justifications that may exist. You can have rational justifications, but the act of the assassination goes against the concept of right for Hegel, because almost to go back to Girard's notion of, the sort of endless cycle of the blood feud sort of potentiality, like this violence that's unending and so forth, that threatens to destroy the society.
Yeah, Hegel wants to see punishment not as something subjective and inner. And this thread we've been following from Girard, if not back to Freud and such, with the band of brothers and the murder of the primordial father and Oedipus and these other things. Whose right is it to extract revenge, right? For Hegel, it has to be sort of objectified and externalized in an authority that is subsumed in a kind of common will, which is why the abstract right section that we read for today ends with punishment, because it's precisely punishment that leads towards morality. It can't be, if the section on abstract right is the sort of liberal atomistic individual, and the most it goes beyond that is the mutual recognition and contract of two individuals, to get to morality and then to ethical life and to laws proper, etc., we have to go through punishment, if you will. And punishment can't stop at mere revenge, right? That's not the end all. The punishment section that ends abstract right, that's not the end all be all of it. But I think that Hegel elaborates in abstract right that the concept of punishment for him is a retributionist type of. If we stop at abstract right, retribution is about as far as we can go with punishment. Now, and for Hegel, it's not a retribution necessarily of like for like in the sense of equality, where you steal something from me, so I get to steal something back.
Yeah, the eye for an eye type.
It has to be this abstract value of, it's not equality in the sense of eye for eye. Yes, it is an equivalence of value that transmutes. But again, that's how Hegel sees retribution at this stage. At abstract right, I think that we can't yet elaborate a notion of law that would be deterrence, or that would even be rehabilitation. We need to get to civil society and to morality for at least deterrence, at the very least, where we can develop the idea of the good, if you will, beyond my subjective want and desire at the moment for this particular thing. And to get to rehabilitation, obviously, you need a wider, broader socius than two abstract atomistic individuals. In any case, your point about vigilante and Donald Trump, what Hegel might say is, I suppose if we were all honored as the criminals we are, right, and not necessarily forgiven by the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ and whatever, because if anything, we have to remember Hegel's a Christian. If we were all brought to bear for our crimes and sins, Trump would have not been in a position to be out in public to be assassinated. His many crimes would have, if we honored him as the criminal he is, he would have been facing other types of punishment. But that's a digression. It doesn't get to the heart of your point about the vigilante. Anyway, we've kind of gone in reverse order and started with punishment. I guess that's the funny thing. But that's the fun part. That's part of the fun.
Doesn't that fit Hegel's method?
Yes,
and
no.
I'm kind of tongue in cheek.
Well, I guess that's the thing, right? Where what historically may come first comes last logically. It's very similar to like Capital, right? Where we end Capital Volume 1 with primitive accumulation, because even if historically it comes first, but we need to start with the logic of the commodity. And that's interesting because in the philosophy of right, we start with the logic of property. Although I will say punishment would already historically and logically come after a presupposition of right or free will or something like this. So maybe it doesn't fit exactly, but I think at least the logic of capital or the logic of the sort of retrospective logic of philosophy that Hegel holds with like the Ala Minerva, it makes sense that what historically may come first should come last logically, or sorry,
Right.
yes, right. And the same thing, right? I think to a certain extent, the liberal atomistic individual that the abstract right hypostasizes or abstracts from and begins with doesn't really appear until the end of history, right? Doesn't really appear until, if you will, the logic of capitalism. So starting with it logically is an abstraction from the historical reality in which humans developed, because, you know, it's not like humans developed as Robinson Crusoe.
Doesn't this just kind of fit the methodology of a deductive reasoning or something like that? A deductive syllogism, or I don't know. I'm out of my depth there a little bit.
I don't know if deductive's the right word, but it fits the retrospective teleology of
that's probably
of speculative logic. If we use deduction, we have to use it in the broadest sense of speculative logic, right? Of in the sense in which the elaboration of the concept out of its abstraction to its concreteness as idea is a deduction, then I think we can use that term. But we have to be very careful with it.
Yeah. I guess I was thinking about because philosophy is backward looking. It can only ever be backward looking for Hegel. So we start with like the painting, the completed painting, and then we start to deduce things from the form and content that comprise the universality, let's say, of the painting, just as a micro example. Once we start to look at the brush strokes, etc., the color palette, blah blah blah, right? At that point, that's just deductive reasoning from my limited understanding of logic and all that shit, which is not an important, we don't necessarily have to spend any more time on that. I was just thinking about this from a methodological standpoint.
If by painting you are using it as a stand-in, a metonymy for
a totality,
for the totality,
correct?
Yeah,
yes.
I think for Hegel, following Aristotle, wants to say that the whole precedes the parts, and except that if we start with the whole, which would be civil society, then I think for Hegel we don't see the development of the concept of freedom, of free will, if you will. If we start with civil society, we start with free will already actualized and concrete. And then if we work back to its abstract moments, there's almost an anticlimactic, in the very logical sense, of unwinding. There's almost like it would be taking the concrete idea and then vaginating back into its simple, immediate determinations. Hegel always wants to start with, this is just how he works, and this is part of the magic trick of dialectics, if you will. He wants to start with the simple immediacy and then invaginate and unfold to the concrete determinations rather than the other way around. I think that's kind of Marx's inheritance from Hegel, right? He starts with the commodity rather than primitive accumulation. There's, whether one wants to see that as part of the logic of retrospective and working backwards rather than forwards, it just depends on the way we orient ourselves in thought and thinking. So do we orient ourselves from the concrete reality to go back to the abstract, or the other way around? And I think that and again, this is a part of like the logic, this is part of the sort of, this is part of the logic of Western metaphysics, as Derrida might say it, right? You know, the abstract is sort of always going to be, if binarized with the concrete, is always going to be seen as kind of less. It's going to be devalued, even though that binary is unstable if we really put force on it. But if we stick with just what's better, the abstract or the concrete's going to be better.
Present.
That's
Yeah.
that's going to be the
Metaphysics
actualized
of
freedom.
presence.
So we have to start with the abstract because that is less, and we have to see those moments play out. It's a synthesis rather than an analysis. It's kind of like when Kant does the Critique of Pure Reason, he wants to see it as this ongoing synthesis. Whereas in the Prolegomena, he thinks of it as an analysis. You could go in a different direction. It just depends upon the type of folding we want to do. Are we unfolding, or are we sort of refolding?
Maybe it's not so bad of a topic to bring up because I was just thinking about it in the context of, because he kind of discusses this as a science of right.
He does use that term. That word is difficult in German because science, not only for the time, for the Enlightenment era, right, but in German, Wissen, right, has a much broader sense of, like when we talk about the human sciences, we don't necessarily, you get what I'm saying, or the sciences of spirit, which involve a kind of literary, artistic extent. So that word has to be, again, thinking of it broadly, but yes, the science of right. Yeah. A theory of right you could also say, right?
I guess this fucks up my whole formulation because we kind of started at an objective fact, right? I think generally, even though science perhaps doesn't operate, modern contemporary scientific practice still has its roots in all of this shit, in the sense that we're taking an objective fact, an actualized real something in the world, and then we're using that as our data, perhaps even that's the data from the experiment, if you'll allow me, and then we make theories based on the data to explain the data, or so I don't know, some shit.
No. I think
maybe I've got that in reverse.
No. I think this is good because this reminds me of one of my favorite opening paragraphs, and I've told you about this, is the opening paragraph of Freud's Instincts and Their Vicissitudes, right? Where he's like, look, we could have the fantasy, the mistaken belief that science begins with well-formed definitions. If we kind of have this fantasy and think that science begins like Spinoza's ethics or Euclid's geometry, and we begin with axioms and then definitions and then build up from here in this well-formed way. Freud's like, no, I mean, in the genesis of a science. Now, at the end, when science may be well-formed, sure, we might already have the definitions and all this, but science in its activity, in its elaboration, in its sort of working through of the idea, we are kind of groping around in the dark. And so definitions sometimes may be ad hoc or may be malleable or should be malleable and should, as you said, be flexible enough to be changeable, to adapt to different data of that type of feeling around based on the observations and explorations at hand. So Freud kind of is giving himself an out by saying, look, psychoanalysis hasn't always stuck to the very same definitions, and I'm doing science in real time. And I think that there's something similar to that with the dialectic, even if the operations may be the same each and every time, the categories that are worked through and what is being brought to light is at the very least we could call it an elaboration, even if the methodology is baked in. So I think that's why we start with the idea of what he calls personality. We start with the person. And in actual fact, lest we fall into a kind of solipsism, it's just for kind of logical simplicity sake that we start with one individual person and then bring in another. If we look at Hegel and the phenomenology of spirit, like in the master bondsman, the master slave dialectic that we've talked about the past few weeks, we know that it takes at least two consciousnesses, two self-consciousnesses it takes mutual recognition for personality to like get to a certain stage. So we start with the fiction of an abstract atomistic personality. this atomization of free will. We start with that fiction, if you will, before we go to contract. And this is in the sections about taking possession and property. There is an interesting move from possession to property, and they're not equivalent. And I think that's good. It's good to talk about it, because if we want to start with the fiction of one personality alone, like a Robinson Crusoe shipwrecked, that's really still at the stage of taking possession in an immediate sense. It's when we get to property in the proper sense that we kind of need another consciousness, we need another personality in order to really get to the meat of the matter of abstract right. So in a sense, like, I hate these crude kind of metaphors and distinctions, and they can easily be broken down. But since we are sort of working with these fictions, which isn't to say untruths, but maybe untruths in the speculative sense, and yet in the sense that they haven't yet developed into the truth of the idea, right? We're in these sort of immediate moments of the dialectic. Something like taking possession is interesting because, again, whether it be Robinson Crusoe, or we could even talk about sheer the immediacy of life, of animality, there's a sense in which taking possession occurs all the time, right? And doesn't necessarily need the mutual recognition of another personality that's where we get to property. But taking possession, this freedom of the will is what we might want to call sort of purely one-sided in the subjective sense. One-sided insofar as it is the immediacy of the will, as he'll call it. It is arbitrary freedom. It is this particular thing becomes mine, but still in an abstract sense, without yet becoming, let's say, whether it be recognized by others or moving into an objective dimension. So taking possession doesn't even require personality to a certain extent. Personality presupposes taking possession, but it's not needed. We can imagine a child, because for Hegel, children don't really have personality in the strict sense, right? When we talk about personality in Hegel's sense, I think we're already at this stage of universal equality. And all I mean by that is that for Hegel, personality is, if you will, in the modern state, and this does cheat a little bit because we're looking forward, or already looking forward, to civil society to justify this, but in the sort of modern Prussian state, if you will, all citizens, so all adult citizens of the Prussian state, are persons in the sense of equality. That's the universality of it. In Greek times, only some people had personality in that sense, and therefore even property. And to a certain extent, feminists could look at Hegel and kind of say, like, well, I don't know about this universality. How much property could women have at that time without the intercession of their husbands or something like this, right? And that is a very valid point and would complicate things greatly, I think. But
yeah, well, I think that's kind of like what might have, I don't know, maybe you could tell me a little bit better, because I think when we were reading, was it Jean Schrader's, what is it, Eroticism of the Market? And she's kind of, I don't know.
The Triumph of Venus, yes.
Right. I don't recall reading, I mean, I don't know that this necessarily jumped off the page from reading Hegel, the Hegel that we read, at least thus far, but she was effectively, if I'm remembering correctly, saying that without property, there's not really subjectivity.
The wording is a little bit weird here because Hegel does distinguish the subject from the person, but I won't go into that. I think that that's just a kind of like, now we're getting into language stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
That is important, but just to say, yes, that insofar for Hegel as property is that through which my freedom, the atomistic individual's freedom, becomes externalized and has the possibility of becoming not just for me in itself, but for others, sort of externalized, objective. This is the interesting thing, right? So like taking possession can be a purely one-sided subjective moment where it could merely be for satisfying needs. And this is why kind of Hegel's theory of property is a little bit different than Rousseau's, because Rousseau sees it in a kind of disequilibrium in the aftermath of the birth of self-consciousness. I think I've told you the story, right, where Rousseau's thinking about this, again, this is one of the great metaphysical moments of Rousseau, where he hypothesizes this notion where everyone's like singing and dancing around the fountain, and there is this like communal property, this kind of communalism and abstract equality, sort of without distinctions and hierarchies. And there is this moment with the birth of self-consciousness, if you will, the fall, if you will, in the Adam and Eve sense, where hierarchies are born and distinctions are made, where I look and I recognize that this other is singing a little bit better, this other is dancing a little bit better. There are these degrees and gradations and distinctions made that then is where inequality starts to rear its head. So property for him becomes this kind of ideological con, if you will. We get kind of tricked into buying into this system of...
Which would be like the sterner take too.
When I say property, I mean private property, because for Hegel, common property isn't yet the ability for the abstract person to externalize their freedom in a thing. It has to be mine, private, so that freedom can externalize itself in the thing, in the taking possession. By my possessions becoming property, I externalize my freedom and objectify it, because that already presupposes the moment where others recognize in this mutual mode, and this is where contract starts to begin, where others recognize that, yes, that is yours, right? It's not just sort of an idealism or a psychologism or a solipsism where I immediately grab this thing and make it mine as a child would. Because again, as I said, children aren't persons for Hegel. As a child would, or even an animal would, by eating the grass in front of it, that kind of taking possession. There's property begins when I externalize my freedom and thereby objectify it through the recognition of others who are like, yeah, that is your, whatever the fuck it is, your piece of land, your coffee cup,
your car, whatever. Yeah. You
could use the most banal commodity examples, right, but we can imagine anything, and he uses the word saka, right? Because there are dinga and saka, right? There are little things like a coffee cup or a car, but Hegel also thinks that they can be abstract. They don't have to necessarily be physical things or physical commodities. But yes, anything that I can externalize my personality and freedom into, my will into, and then in a communal way have recognition from others that those are mine. That's for Hegel an essential movement. That's the real point of property in this section of abstract right. It's not to sort of, if you will, justify sort of the outgrowth of capitalism. We could read it cynically that way. I don't think that's what's going on here. I think the story that Hegel is trying to tell is, how does my freedom, which is essentially subjectively, immediately spontaneity, a spontaneous arbitrary, that's the word he likes to use, arbitrary will, how does that will, which in its contradiction with itself, not actually free will, become free? And it becomes free by externalizing itself, by going outside of itself into things, and becomes an extension, a sort of prosthetic, if you will, for the will. The will to go beyond its spontaneity and one-sided subjectiveness and its arbitrariness, it needs to go outside itself, become objectified, and be recognized by others.
Right. It has to be actualized effectively in some manner.
That begins the process of actualizing the sort of negatively free will. It's negative because its freedom is merely spontaneity and particularity, right? It's this particular thing or that particular thing. And it becomes more objective. It joins the particular and the universal, as Hegel wants to say, right? The particularity of my will to desire, insofar as self-consciousness for Hegel is desire, right? Insofar as I self-consciously particularize my will in this one thing, I am also giving substance to the universality of other wills, other persons. By my property becoming recognized by you, I also recognize you and your property. And there is, again,
Right.
that's the reciprocity.
It's interesting, like the dialectic of the God. I might have lost my train of thought, but I'll try to retrieve it. It's like the recognition of difference. And this even goes towards like, because of this notion of the free and of subjectivity and its relation to property for Hegel, I wonder if perhaps this is why I believe it's in Symbolic Death and Exchange that Baudrillard's saying that primitive societies did not have an unconscious. I mean, we don't have to necessarily derail, but I was wondering, like, that it kind of got me thinking in that sense, just because if those differences in the social that you talked about with the Rousseau example don't manifest themselves in a certain, maybe conceptual.
It's like a pre-lapsarian vision of man, right? Yeah. So but yes, it hasn't become conceptualized. You're right.
There's something with difference and this whole process, but that was just a kind of an aside. You don't have to.
Well, you could say that if you're following that thread, for Rousseau, if that's the state at which this moment before the recognition of differences and the hierarchy ensues and inequality, this prelapsarian moment, this before the fall, before the birth of self-consciousness, this is when differences remain in themselves, or difference remains in itself and hasn't yet become for others. We don't have the moment of mutual recognition yet. And I think that for Hegel, this is another type of fiction. Or this is a kind of fantasy. This is why the noble savage type spiel it's just as much of a fantasy as Hobbes, war of all against all, man is a wolf for man. There is a sense in which I think that Hegel tries to subsume and sublate that, and Hobbes and Rousseau, in the master-slave dialectic. Because the truth of the master-slave dialectic, as we said, is that the master becomes the slave of the slave, and vice versa. Because the master needs the slave to be able to... The master only finds recognition as master through the mediation of the slave. There is the sense in which, even though the master wins in the beginning because of being able to stake life and sort of raise himself above life in the face-off to the death, in the end he becomes subservient to the slave for that recognition as master. Lacan makes this go through the way of knowledge, as we've seen, right? The master merely enjoys the fruits of the labor of the slave, whereas the slave is toiling away in the domains of knowledge and actually has the know-how and elaborates the skills and actually is sort of working on nature and creating, etc. But that does take us far afield. Not too far, but it does. I will say, that we don't get the master-slave dialectic in abstract right. I think that it's in the milieu, it's in the environment, it's lurking around the corner. But in this section particularly, right, we don't have that play out.
Yeah.
Now, it doesn't mean we can't talk about it. I just think,
Well, he does at the end bring up slavery in the sense of like he's saying that both the slave and the slave holder, and this maybe would go to Baudrillard too, are responsible. Like the slave is responsible for its position as the slave, just as much as the slave holder, let's say. In the sense, if you're being scientific and like wiping away all the presuppositions, looking at this in a very objective fashion and maybe even isolated fashion, there is the idea that yes, the slave could take its life, right? Like in the example of the master-slave dialectic, right? The slave could opt to end his life. Is that right? Would maybe be the interesting way to tie it back into the real meat of the discussion, because he also gets into this notion of does the individual have a right to commit suicide?
So there's two things going on here. First, the discussion of slavery is brought in that last section on wrong, which is wrong, crime, punishment. This last section that leads to morality. And in that, he's talking about there are three types of crime, right? There's the unintentional crime, right? If we stick with mutual recognition, you and I could both claim X, Y, or Z as our property. And it could just be... And again, we aren't in the domain of legal disputes, right? No apparatuses of judiciary, legislative, whatever. It could just be $1 on the sidewalk. Although it could be a shell on a beach, right? Let's keep it as abstract as possible because money already presupposes all kinds of other shit, right? And I claim it as mine. You said I saw it first, right? Again, we're almost in the domain of children here, right? Because taking possession
right of
can be
first
done.
possession.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I called shotgun, right? Or something like this, right? So that's just for him a collision of wills, and that is unintentional wrong. He calls it a collision of wills because it is about this wherein does, the right lay. And there may not be any universal way of adjudicating that dispute, right? And I'm not just talking about external authorities, but there would have to be some sort of negotiation going on. And I think that's why it immediately leads, or that's why wrong is immediately preceded by contract, because we've already talked about how in my mutual recognition of you as a person with property, and you've externalized your freedom and things, and I've externalized my freedom and things. One of my ways of externalizing my freedom is the ability to dispose of my property, and we can exchange, right? Because for Hegel, as Schrader made clear too, gift is not really, properly speaking, a mutual type of thing, because it's really an exchange where I've given something and you've given something. You've received something, I've received something. There's a reciprocity rather than in gift. We've already talked about the unilaterality of gift, but it's good to mention it again. In your example of the slave, and I'll let you respond. I'm sorry. I'm just trying to give context.
Oh, you're good. I'm glad
This
you're
is-
doing that.
So if the first wrong is unintentional wrong, it could be very banal. Again, a shell on the beach, a rock, a pretty rock, doesn't matter. Then the second wrong is deception, where I recognize you as a person, but I use that to your disadvantage in the sense in which, because again, we already presuppose contract, right? So in our mutual recognition and in the notion of the way contract works, which is about a sort of an equivalence in the sense of value, if not obviously an identity of things, but we reach an agreement about you benefiting and I benefiting, and we exchange our property, right? Insofar as we found a measuring stick for value. I use your participation in that sense of contract, your goodwill against you, right? I deceive you. And Hegel wants to say deception is not as bad as crime, one of the versions of which is coercion, because at the very least in deception, I still recognize you as a person. I take advantage of that, but I still recognize you as a person. Whereas in crime, and this is why he says the concept cancels itself out, where in coercion, I not only I do not recognize you as a person precisely because I take it to the point of, let's say, holding a gun to your head, right? Because it's not quite master slave, but it's similar in the sense in which the master slave dialectic, at least in Hegel's sense, is this sort of facing of the wills to the death. And one raises itself above life and is able to risk life, and the other does not. So I put the gun to your head and I force you to act against your will. So I am actively negating your will insofar as I am sort of giving you the choice, just as in the master-slave dialectic, your free will or your life. I am wagering that you will choose to act against your free will and preserve your life. Now, for Hegel, we still have to choose not to wager our life. We still have to choose to do what the man with the gun to our head says, right? We still have to choose to give our wallet or whatever the fuck it is to act against our free will. We still have to choose to negate our free will in coercion. This is why he uses the example of the slave choosing the coercive option rather than dying. And I think that this is something that we can see play out in theories of like Western liberalism and this notion of we will be greeted as liberators and we'll bring democracy and all of this shit. Which is not to say that those peoples would not necessarily flourish if they would have developed their own means of negotiating and choosing for themselves in their own free will and their own common general will to elaborate those structures of democracy or whatever form they choose. So implanting democracy in the Middle East is what that was one of the like benevolent ways in which Bush's wars were seen. We're going to bring civilization to the savages, if you want to like use colonialist terms. to a certain extent, for Hegel, that's not going to work. For Hegel, yes, there is a sense in which historically slaves have been freed through manumission, but in a sense, for Hegel, only the slave can free himself, right? That has to be something worked through in the dialectic of self-consciousness, and one has to desire, and which, again, as I said, for Hegel, self-consciousness in its actual form is desire, but one has to desire to be free. And so only you can kind of set yourself free in this interesting Hegelian way, because you have to raise yourself to the point where you are sort of above life and willing to sort of risk your life in that sense, rather than cling to life. Because for Hegel, the slave is the slave not to the master but to life. The slave clings to life in that duel to the death of the wills. The slave remains unfreed, not to the master as though it were an external force, but to the inner necessity of this will to cling to bare life to a certain extent. That's not the phrase Hegel uses. I know I'm kind of bastardizing Agamben here, and that's not even maybe Agamben's point at all, ever. It's just, if we think about it, the slave would rather live and therefore be able to continue even an animal existence than to rise to that status of personhood. A lot of this has a lot of like really ugly sort of metaphysical presuppositions to it. And I'm not trying to justify Hegel. I'm just trying to like work through some of the logic of it, because you know how I feel about Hegel. I do think it is important to understand what's going on in that dialectic and what's going on in why coercion as crime, or as this example of what he's calling crime. You know, you have unintentional wrong, just the collision of wills, which could be banal. You have deception, which at least I still recognize you as a person, even if I'm taking advantage of you. You know, in the Kantian sense, lying, I'm taking advantage of you. I'm using you as, you know, I'm not treating you as an end in yourself. But I think Hegel's a little bit more subtle here, right? Because for Kant, lying would somehow be on a similar scale as coercion. And I think for Hegel, no, there's something worse about coercion. I'm actively negating your possibility of willing, or I'm making that one of the choices. And you still can choose, but to a certain extent, it's not really just about means and ends anymore. Because if we just stick to the means and end things, then Kant's totally right about don't lie to the murderer at your door who's going to kill your friend. I think for Hegel, and I think rightly for most people, that type of scale of values just doesn't fly.
Were you done?
I think so. I swear there was another part to it, but I wanted to at least get to your part about the slave freeing himself. If there was another part, we'll come back to it. And, you know, when you listen back, you may realize what else I was going to say. But I do think that was the important part. No, it's fine. This is fine.
No, I'm not mad. I'm just saying it happened. Like, I'll be listening back and I'll be like, God damn it. Like, I'll either miss the point that you've made, or like an opportunity to respond well, or I'll like, you might say something and then I'm like, it like goes over my, you know what I mean? Just in the midst of things, I miss it.
I think the reason why he goes to slave is that insofar as I coerce you, I treat you as though you were a slave. And this gets to the point about the criminal, and I will let you respond. When I told you that for Hegel, and this gets back to the retributivist logic, which again, as I said, gets more complicated when we move to civil society, because then we have laws and then we have a kind of commonality of will and are able to negotiate different types of punishments and et cetera. But in the abstract right, when we are talking about making an equality of punishment meeting the crime, which isn't necessarily Dante's fantasy in the Inferno, where there is a kind of figura going on, right? Where I did XYZ and there's a reversal and I have to experience XYZ. I think that type of abstract equivalence or particularity of equivalence, Hegel is like, no, it doesn't have to be that way. That would be a little bit absurd and sort of on the nose. The only strict eye for an eye that Hegel has, and this is interesting, because he even is saying, hey, it's a good thing we're moving away from the death penalty, because in the old days, revenge in that broad sense where you did something wrong and we don't have a yardstick for value in Hegel's sense of equivalence of how do we punish this crime, then the death penalty is a one size fits all. he's like, it's kind of a good thing that we move more and more away from the death penalty. But I think the only strict equivalence or identity that Hegel has is murder, right? Murder is to be met with by the putting to death of the criminal. Now, I think that Hegel leaves himself open to some criticism here because that already brings in notions of capital punishment. But if we want to be a little bit broader and flexible, we could be maybe thinking of, and this is part of what we've talked about for the last few weeks, where he's thinking of, there is a right for the mob or for the aggrieved to like get revenge against the murderer, right? Blood right, or what is it, weregild? Weregild is paying off. You pay an equivalent fine for like killing someone's brother, but I think for Hegel that has to be only paid in blood. We are in this retribution. If there's not an eye for an eye, there's at least a life for a life. At the very least, it's important to understand that Hegel's ideas of punishment in abstract right are going to lead us to the next session on morality, because it becomes a question of how I, if you will, not only particularize my will and desire on this one thing in front of me, let's say, to satisfy a need, hunger, thirst, whatever, to satisfy needs. It becomes this question of how my will becomes in harmony or becomes able to harmonize with a standard of objective right. So how is what I see good then reflected more broadly and given objective form and reflective recognition in what is considered good outside of me, right? Not just in itself, but like for itself or for others, right? In this sort of chorus of personalities. How do I begin to gauge the self-consciousness qua desire with the good, almost in like the Platonic sense? How does what is good, because you remember how Freud starts in his negation essay, like, when I take things into me, if it feels good, it's good. If I spit it out, it's bad. That's the affirmation negation thing. So how is it that the things that I affirm can be objectively like take on concrete actual form, and there can be a kind of correspondence, if you will, of the good that I do and that I will, and this good outside of me? How can I like will? How can I will to will that good that I see out there? So I think that's why we end with punishment, right? We end with the ways that, and I think in a certain sense, if property externalizes and makes objective my free will and freedom, it's punishment that shows the delimitated sphere and outlines and territories of right. But that still needs to be then reflected more broadly and then take on sort of standardizations, if you will. But that's only the mediating moment from the abstract to the ethical. It's really in civil society and what he calls the state that we will see this in the most concrete form. So morality is just another stepping stone, but it is a further progression of right, because it gets us sort of outside of just right in this abstract sense between atomistic individuals and starts to develop these networks of the good actions and the good activities.
I was going to ask if you think, does public execution have any truck with what you're kind of getting at?
This is tough, man. I mean, this is part of what Lacan kind of discusses, at least in outline and in depth somewhat in his Lacan discusses in his Kant with Sade. And I've always described it, even though this is not how Lacan says it, but there is a sense in which the Sadean executioner, for as depraved as he may be, because of the way that he thinks about this kind of inverted categorical imperative where anything I want to do to you, you have to allow me to do for you, right? This kind of universalization of perversion into like willing it. Anyway, the Sadean executioner can take as much pleasure as he wants to. You can imagine in the Sadian community, everybody raises their hand because they want to be the executioner, right? That would just give them all kinds of joy. But the Kantian executioner, in Hegel, this is developed in civil society. It's precisely the Kantian executioner who does his duty without any sort of pathological excess of pleasure. I don't take pleasure in what I'm about to do, right?
Right, like Ned Stark beheading.
Like Ned Stark, yeah, I know. That's exactly right. And
it's duty, it's not passion.
It's duty, and to a certain extent, it wouldn't be the one who passes the sentence should swing the sword, because to a certain extent, I'm not passing the sentence, the sort of universal will made maxim. It's like the sort of categorical imperative is passing the sentence. But nevertheless, I embody this universality of the categorical imperative. Now, the point being, Sod, if we take him seriously, whether or not literally, that's a whole other question. But if we take him seriously and what he's trying to elaborate in his ethics, if you will, or in his like inversion of the traditional forms of ethics, Sod is trying to think about a way in which the one thing that should be outlawed is capital punishment. This is the weird thing where he's trying to sort of almost, again, invert or invaginate or show the other side of state power. It's precisely the height of power that has the right of death over its subjects, right? It's precisely the state that can put me to my death. And we can see kind of Kafka going off in this absurdist mode with like the trial and these other things, right? So yeah, there is a sense in which, for Sod, right and crime are not in such an easy dialectic as we see in Hegel. They don't mutually sort of reinforce the boundaries of one another, but become amalgamated in a way that forces us to think about the objective structures in which power exerts itself on subjects. And I think for Sod, this is why he is kind of trying to think through crime in a way that would and probably does horrify, moral realists or whatever. But again, for Sod, it's capital punishment that he wants to circumscribe. If there is something to be outlawed or prohibited, forbidden, it is precisely that. And of course, Lacan works through this in terms of, reading Sod's, accounts. And he's making fun of it as dry literature, but he's trying to think about the way in which these subjects that are going through the most torturous types of inflictions are like sustaining the impossible jouissance and yada yada without ever passing out or dying of their wounds or whatever. So it's the limits of jouissance to a certain extent. And I think that reading is a strong one because it helps to clarify why crime is pushed all the way to capital punishment, or why my right extends all the way up to that. And to a certain extent, if my right over your body is made into a categorical imperative, where can that coalesce in the common will and capital punishment? Again, that's where Ned Stark now is no longer a Kantian, but a Sadian, where it's, I'm not the state, I am me, and I'm going to enjoy doing what I feel is my duty or my will made maxim. Not in some sort of state that's disembodied and therefore is taking the blame for me, right, in the Kantian sense, where no, it's my duty to this higher good and will that stands above us. No, this is like from the depths of my bowels that I execute you, not in the name of some state. Now, it would be interesting how Stirner accords with this, and we might have to read Kant with Sod. I think that's about 50, 60-ish pages, 40, 50. I think you might get off on it, and I mean that, in context. Anyway, you may have been trying to lead me somewhere about capital punishment.
I was just thinking about, for it to be a universal, for the universal law to apply, like it has to become idea and be actualized. The actual real punishment being carried out and being like something about it being witnessed itself is what gives it the, I don't know, the libidinal capital punishment can't just exist in a conceptual realm, in the realm of ideas on its own. Like it has to be actualized. So people have to witness the punishment for the law to have any kind of, I don't know, deterrence at all or something like that.
But yeah, again, I guess this is where we have
I
to
mean, even thinking back to Foucault, right? Like there's a whole spectacle made of the punishment, right?
Yeah, yes,
With
yeah,
the,
of
what
course.
is it, discipline and punish, etc.
Or yeah, the horrifying notion, the intro to Discipline and Punish, where the quartering, and this is kind of part of the Nietzschean sense too, that Hegel doesn't quite answer. Where in the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche asks, how is it that debt can be paid through pain suffered? If you remember, Deleuze and Guattari bring this up, where they talk about the sort of, in primitive territorial societies, it's not about sort of an Oedipal triangle. The triangle is between the eye that takes pleasure, sort of the hand that wounds, and sort of the flesh that takes on the signs, right? This is why culture is the movement, or sorry, yeah. What is it? It's culture is the movement of, is it violence across bodies? I'm not saying it quite right, but culture plants flags of desire in bodies, right? It's all about marking, as they say, right? And for Nietzsche, culture is this violent training already. And so there is a violence inherent in the triangular, but there has to be an eye that extracts pleasure in order for there to be equivalence, I think. So yes, this is part of the spectacle that you're getting at. The spectacular element has to be there in order for there to be an equivalence. This is just left as subtext for Hegel, or just presumed for Hegel, that for there to be an equivalent value of the punishment in order to cancel out, because we are in the realm of sublation, right? We are trying to cancel out the wrong done in order to not just preserve right, which has been infringed, but to cancel out the infringement, right? And to therefore raise right up to its proper sphere, which becomes morality. We have to at least stipulate that there can be an equivalence in the punishment rendered for the crime committed. And for Nietzsche, he asks a much more basic question. How can this equivalence be made possible? How can the debt be paid back in a type of suffering? Pain inflicted for him. If we stick to a quantitative regime, how is there this equivalence granted? And there has to be a surplus value extracted by the eye, which would be sort of the communal eye, if you will, right? It would not be a privatized eye, because we're not talking about the despot yet, if you will, who would begin this privatization. We're still talking about this kind of eye of the community. So yeah, I think you're very much correct when you talk about the idea has to be actualized, which doesn't just mean that obviously physical punishment has to occur. It's that the actualization requires recognition.
Yes, that's the way that's the key. Yeah.
And that's why we will get to a more nuanced theory of punishment in civil society, in the civil society sections. And that's why it's wrong to stop at a Hegel of abstract right and think that his theory of punishment stops there. Because if it did stop there, we would be merely left with retribution. And that is not satisfying enough. That does not give us the range and gamut of the idea of punishment. It's merely a preparatory, sort of propedeutic. It's the midwife of morality, if you will. It helps to birth the idea along its way and sort of propel it in its invaginating force outside of its sort of kernel, its shell, its womb, whatever metaphor I'm monstrously giving rise to. But I guess that's the thing, right? That this is what Hegel wants to call reason. There's a sense in which, if I were to answer from Hegel, the reason why he doesn't ask Nietzsche's question is that Hegel would want to say, Nietzsche asked the question of the understanding. He's asking this question of sort of one-sided determination. His equivalence is cynical, if you will, if you want to use like layperson's terms, where it doesn't see the unfolding of reason, where where the external necessities or the externalities of freedom, the arbitrariness of freedom, and two, the arbitrariness of punishment as mere retribution can become an inner necessity. This is kind of what Hegel juxtaposes in the philosophy of right, is this difference between the understanding and its one-sidedness and comprehension, which is more properly understood as reason, which will lead to the idea and its concreteness. I don't know if I buy what I just said, but I'm trying to like.
No, man, we're thinking through the shit, and that's the best we can do, I think.
Yeah, I guess I would say that. How is it that like right can move from this externality or this particularity, this one-sidedness, to an inner necessity?
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
How can contingency become necessary? I think that's Hegel's question.
That's
Right.
that's good. That's
how
good.
how could the contingency of my will is arbitrary? And this is why I think this is
Your
what
particular will.
Yeah, this is why property is where he starts. It's not because he's presupposing capitalist relations.
Right.
Again, this could be a way of reading him, and it's a cynical way of reading him. And I think that whether or not that's true, one can. I'm not sure if I buy that, because there's a sense in which that would be a kind of naive way of reading it, because one could then say, why does Marxist capital start with the commodity? It's a way of presupposing the legitimacy of capital relations. Well, that doesn't make any fucking sense. So we should at least be as fair to Hegel as to Marx, even if Hegel never, develops a theory and critique of capitalism. I do think that his reason for, and I will say, we're going to get more about property in civil society. We've really just got bare bones, because the bare bones of the property is to try to. Now, we could criticize him for wanting to begin the dialectic with freedom and will, and how the will truly becomes free and all of this, and maybe criticize that starting point and its metaphysical presuppositions. I think that's a little bit more legitimate than just saying, well, he starts with property and it has to be private and blah, blah, blah. Well, okay, yes. Why does he start with private property? But again, that's to try to give juice and movement to how the arbitrary free will becomes the truly free will. So if we want to criticize the unfolding of the system, we have to kind of criticize the starting point. And I think that Deleuze might say it this way, is like, okay, so the way then to pose it is, why is the will a problem? Because the free will in its immediacy is actually not free. So how is that the problem for Hegel? And I think that that's his way of solving this, is to go through property. Because my freedom is never truly mine unless it can be in a
the punishment, it has to be recognized.
Yeah, it has to.
It has to be recognized as such.
Yeah,
as having a force behind it.
Yeah, that's kind of where I'm going. Again, I'm trying to be as fair to Hegel as possible. This might displease our listeners. If we talk about Hegel in other contexts, I'm happy to dismiss him.
I mean, we're not here to bash Hegel per se, but my problematic element of his logic with regard, or let me walk through this and see what you say about this, because I think this might have some relevance. And maybe this is even putting words in Hegel's mouth because of the Schrader reading that we did weeks ago, in that I can almost see the logic of it would be better for all exchange to be based on contract and as a commodity, because of something like there not being this ambiguity of action. All social relations are sort of very clear and spelled out and easy to follow. They're made manifest through the contract exchange. It's the particularity where we run into problems, I think, at the level of society. You know what I mean? It's once we start to apply contra Deleuze, once we start to apply justice on a case-by-case basis, then it can't work, because there's no universal recognition, if that makes sense, in the wider, not between perhaps even you and I, but the wider society. And this would almost go to Girard to some, in a kind of way. Are you kind of following me in the sense of here's my example would be, oh, well, you are Donald Trump, you have a bunch of money, your justice is different than, and I mean, this is plays out in our society, right? It's like, justice that rich people receive is not the same justice that there's not equal recognition under the law, whereas money is concerned all the time. Like, again, it's not always that black and white, right? Like, there are occasions where the rich are punished, but there's a lot of leeway in our modern judicial system towards
Right.
rich people that's not
And that's a
experienced
failure of
by
the
it.
dialectic.
That's the failure of the dialectic.
Not Hegel's dialectic, but that just means that the idea hasn't been fully actualized, right? That it's been sort of perverted and set off course and hasn't fully yet.
Yeah,
Justice, as
universal justice
as you're
hasn't
talking
been
about, that would see persons as equal, which doesn't mean having equal things, or even it would be more that, I mean, justice is blind is how we normally talk about it, right? And the fact that it's usually not blind, or that it has one eye, that's closed, but one eye is open and looks the other way, that isn't yet, whether we say the dialectic hasn't come to completion. It's been reverted to a moment, like with Hegel criticizing Roman law, in the fact that for Hegel, slavery is not rational, right? It does not accord with the concept of free will, of freedom, of the actuality of the will of human beings as moral agents, and et cetera.
Right.
I guess I would say, like, in terms of the questions you're asking, though, about justice and jurisprudence.
Well, the Roman stuff is
and
interesting because he talks about how they couldn't have had a universal concept of the human, or they wouldn't have been able to justify slavery. If they recognized all humans,
at least they wouldn't be able to rationally think through
that's
it.
true. Right.
They could justify it all they want, and I think that's
in the wrong. Yeah.
This is Hegel's thing about the understanding. It's like the understanding can justify slavery. We've seen even in what the past 2 centuries how America did it. You can clothe it in biblical terms, but that type of justification isn't reason for Hegel, right? And I think that too is why I brought up the preface when we first started, where he's talking about there are these justifications that are based on these feelings, where something feels good and therefore is good. And for Hegel, that's quite almost always never the case, right? This is why the sphere of morality is the next step from punishment, right? Why, if revenge and retribution is something that feels good and it's making equivalent, that doesn't necessarily bring us into the moral. So how is it that punishment and finding an equivalence that isn't mere revenge, isn't cycle of retribution? How can a retributivism that isn't a cycle of retribution give us this negative moment, this cliffhanger that then builds into the moral sphere, where the good becomes not just in itself, but for itself, or whatever the fuck, how it can take on an objective sphere and not merely be the good for me, but accord with this common general will. And that's when we will start to get building blocks that lead us to justice, and even things like jurisprudence, where there can be a case-by-case logic that has its own internal problems and solutions and determinations, and doesn't necessarily have a mere sort of grid of application that would be axiomatic. That's the thing that I think is difficult, because to a certain extent, abstract right is always case by case, because we are still really in the realm of these atomistic individuals, right? When we talk about contract and abstract right, we're really just talking about you and me, and not this broader. We were talking about an abstraction, again, these legal fictions where legality isn't even yet conceptualized. So we really are talking about, again, and jurisprudence doesn't even work, but we are talking about a case by case basis, where it is wills, hopefully, like in the best of cases, harmonizing in contract, but also we see that they can be conflicting, and they can involve deception and coercion and these other things, whereby for Hegel the concept of freedom is infringed upon. So how does that negative moment is a necessary step for Hegel, I think, to move beyond abstract right to morality.
I mean, I read it in kind of the opposite sense, in the way that, like, if we want to achieve the good, it's clear that we can't just have a feelings alone are not sufficient enough to bring about the good on their own. We have to generate a desire. We have to actualize that desire for the good somehow.
We have to become self-conscious. The truly free will has to take itself as its own object. That's how Hegel talks about it. Again, this shit is maddening sometimes, but
Yeah, I know.
but it kind
Not as
of
bad as Kant, at least.
but it kind of makes sense, right? It kind of makes sense. It is actually slightly Kantian, even though Hegel isn't necessarily working merely with the categorical imperative. He's working in the wake of its theorization, whereby the will takes willing to its like maximum. It's what if this particular will were universalized? For Hegel, it's like, how can this particular free will in the abstract sense take itself to its limit? And that's why in the earlier philosophy, Hegel is using this dialectic of the finite and the infinite, right? Because to a certain extent, it's the sphere of morality that the terms he's using in philosophy, right, are like the subjective and the objective, or the inner and the external. But there is a sense in which it is this question of sort of the finitude of my particular good entering into this relationship with this infinite universal good, where it's good for all and can take on this application whereby all persons sort of recognize the good and externalize it. That starts to be the concatenation of a society. We live in a society. And I think that's kind of what Hegel's trying to say, because that's not the end all be all of right. These are just the most abstract determinations.
Interestingly, he does have and you've attributed a similar idea, I believe, to Nietzsche, that there's a lag, I suppose, or there's like, it takes time for this kind of stuff to work through the unconscious. Obviously, he doesn't use that language, but there is a quote about something that suggests that. I can probably find the quote. I'm pretty sure.
It takes time for these moments to become self-conscious, right? I mean, to become for itself. It takes time for the end itself to become for itself, we could say. It takes time for
the concept to be liberated or some shit.
Well, to work through the shapes of its actuality, to reach the idea, we could say. The concept in itself to become concrete and work out its inner determinations and its moments and its particular speculative logic to become absolute idea. That takes time. It may take the infinity of time. That's part of the crux of the situation.
Maybe it's this: the will is not complete and universal until it is determined, and until this determination is superseded and idealized, it does not become will until it is this mediating rather activity, and its return unto itself. I think you just said that more or less a few minutes ago.
It's slightly different language, but that's when the willfulness. That's kind of a translation of his German willfulness, which is arbitrary will, which is paradoxically free but not free, right? It's free to choose any one thing and yet has not become objective and externalized. How that can become free will, and then how the will as free can take itself as an object rather than any one particular object. That's how it raises itself to the maximum, to the limit. That's why it is like the categorical imperative. How can I sort of harmonize my will with that which everyone should at all times will?
Yeah, nice. Okay.
Which is why, but again, Hegel isn't fully a categorical imperativist, but he's at least not discrediting the force of that type of formulation.
Right.
I mean, even as I've told you before, Nietzsche works out his own kind of categorical imperative, where he's like, look, if you are told you are going to live this life again and again without change, your first instinct could be to despair and be exhausted and want to have nothing to do with that. Or you could have had that one moment that justified all the pain and suffering and bullshit that you had to pull through, that culminated your life's being and essence, right? The sort of full concreteness of spirit. You could have had that moment of ecstasy, and you should do everything you can to, like, it's carpe diem type shit if you reduce it to it, but it's like, make those moments count, right? Make it such that you will your eternal return in all things. Shit's not easy to do, but that's part and parcel of when we reach those moments of clarity, which usually are not post nut clarity, because post nut clarity is like, why the fuck did I just do that weird thing? I just did that silly thing. We've all had those moments where life takes on its reason for being, and there's an exaltation in the innocence of becoming. So it's like, but for Nietzsche, it's like you can't have those heights of ecstasy without all the other bullshit. So you have to affirm all the other bullshit, right? You have to affirm the whole of chance as to
negate the bullshit, sublate the bullshit, and raise it up.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, but that's one way of. I mean, if you want to stick with Hegelian terms, that is a way of sublating all of the dregs of existence, where you make chicken salad out of the chicken shit.
It's like the reading we did of Simone Doan, and the way that you take the negative resistance of the air-cooled engine and use it as a positive force within the functioning of the system, so that it moves towards concreteness. Maybe a similar process of using from a social standpoint with regard to right and morality and so forth.
I think so. I think you're onto something there, where there is a sense in which, as the concept develops towards the concrete idea in its actualization, the parts are starting to cohere a little bit more into the whole, even if the whole, to a certain extent, precedes it chronologically, logically. We need to look at the parts and how they are cohering to make this well lubricated machine of civil society. So at some point we will come back and continue this reading. We'll move on to morality. I'm sure we'll take a couple of breaks and excursions before we do more Hegel, but it would be good to see where this leads and where we end up and how we feel about the philosophy of right at the end, because at the end, when we get to civil society, we'll also get to read alongside that Marx's contributions to a critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. And we'll get to read his more or less short, I think it's like 80, maybe less pages on the final section of Hegel's philosophy of right. But we need to do the legwork to get there. It would be doing ourselves a disservice, I think, to just start with Marx's critique and not know exactly what went into. Again, it's kind of like looking at under the hood of a car without knowing what the parts are doing. You're going to get kind of lost and not know.
I mean, it'll also be interesting to see how Stirner takes some of this stuff from Hegel and plays with it, because there was not a lot, but I pulled several little examples that I don't know if we necessarily. I didn't grab anything from the unique in its property yet, but I did just grab selections of this text that I thought pointed to things that either Stirner was responding to, or maybe using, where he was kind of developing his response.
I would hold on to those and pull those for when we do some Stirner, because I think that's what we're going to do. I guess after we talk to Matt about Merleau-Ponty and Husserl, we'll maybe do a little bit of Stirner. At the very least, we'll do that before we come back to another piece of Hegel.
I mean, the unique in its property.
And that word is the same in Hegel.
So, Stirner gets his notions.
Eigentum.
Yeah, I think we can call it here. We did a fairly decent enough broad overview.
Yeah, I think that's
but there's still a lot of super interesting little nuggets that dig into some of these topics as well, just for the listener.
I know I moved quickly over it, but I should have said it earlier, but the reason why Hegel at Abstract Right wants to insist upon the retributionist or retributivist aspect of punishment is because it's like honoring the criminal with, even if they in their crime may have disregarded the personality of the other and not recognized it and reduced the other to an animal or a thing or to that status. In punishing the criminal, one recognizes them as persons. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's like there is a right, the criminal has the right to be punished for their infringements. There is this interesting way in which punishment reinforces not necessarily the drive to revenge or even the drive, even the
It's like the
movement.
social bond, I think.
It's the drive to reinforce the social bond of mutually recognizing consciousnesses. I think that's
Absolutely
key to it, and that is what reinforces right, and that's what again propels this negative movement to morality. If we don't have that notion that Hegel believes that there is a right to be, even if rights have been infringed by the criminal and even the worst criminal, there's a way in which
due process, right? Due process.
Right is a due process. Yeah, exactly right. So right is doubly restored, not only in the equivalence of the punishment with the crime,
Not just in the particular, but in the universal. Yeah,
but in the universal affirmation of the personhood of the criminal, right, and thereby will and freedom, etc. All of that is restored. So you are both honoring the criminal and honoring the mutual recognition of persons. That's how morality gets its motive force. And without that, we are not left with enough mobility to continue the dialectical wheels turning.
One last thing. I mean, I want to read this and say just a couple of things. I won't keep us long, though. It's within the state, heroes are no longer possible. They occur only in the absence of civilization, which, like I told you, sounds like it could be straight out of Frank Herbert's Dune. It could be the little, it's not an epilogue. I forget what those things are called. Epigraph. That could open the chapter, right? Because that would be an indictment of Muad'Dib in a sense.
Of Paul, the hero logic behind seeing Paul as the great man theory of history, right? I think Hegel is arguing against the great man theory of history.
Yes.
Even if at the same time, I guess for Hegel it would have been Napoleon.
Right, yeah. The Weltgeist.
Yeah,
the world
right.
Spirit. Kwisatz Haderach was Napoleon.
Yeah, so Hegel himself had at times been moved by enthusiasm of the historical period. I will say, Hegel too, he's like, look, we are a product of our times and we can't necessarily leap over them and transcend them in order to judge our times from this transcendent point. We have to do an immanent critique. There's no external point of view to look down on ourselves and judge ourselves from sort of fixed categories. I think this is another way he justifies the dialectic, as try to sort of churning out these ideas from these base lower moments into these higher concrete forms. But we might have to contextualize that quote, but I'll let you say something.
Well, I was going to say it was kind of interesting that Hegel's considered an absolute idealist. I mean, I know this is kind of inside baseball bullshit, and the distinction is less of a hang up. I think it kind of reads as a weird materialism to me. So he's not a liberal per se, even if his philosophy may justify some aspects of liberalism. He's a lot more sophisticated in his thinking and rigorous in his process and logic.
It's like the classical liberal, right? I mean, it's that weird distinction. It's not a neo-lib. It's the liberal in the sense of the Enlightenment. Let me see if I can find that quote and we can end. He cheats a little bit every now and then he'll cheat a little bit every now and then by being like, look, in the family and in the ethical state. Oh, so this is in the section on coercion. That's great. He cheats a little bit by being by looking forward from abstract right to these later determinations. So either an ethical existence has already been posited in the family or state, in which case the natural condition referred to above as an act of violence against it, or there is nothing other than a state of nature, a state governed entirely by force, which is the Hobbesian regime, right? In which case the idea sets up a right of heroes against it. Within the state, heroes are no longer possible. They occur only in the absence of civilization. The end they pursue is rightful, necessary, and political, and they put it into effect as a cause of their own. The heroes who founded states and introduced marriage and agriculture admittedly did not do this as their recognized right, and these acts still appear as a product of their particular will, but as the higher right of the idea against the state of nature, this coercion employed by heroes is a rightful coercion for goodness alone can have a little effect when confronted with the force of nature. Again, I think that he's already doing a little bit of, again, kind of cheating by contrasting. Because when we're talking about abstract right in this sense, we aren't necessarily talking about the state of nature. So he is kind of doing this weird outside space of ethical state. The contrary to it would be the state of nature for him. It's this almost absolute either or. Because again, when we're in the abstract right section, when I said that we are not yet at a place where we have legislature or judicial system, etc., it's not that we haven't gotten there historically. The abstract right isn't like a historical phenomenon. This is just literally an abstraction, again, a fiction from a sort of atomism of society, which is why I said it's kind of interesting that this notion of an atomistic individual really comes at the end of history and not at the beginning. We don't start as atomistic individuals and then get to morality and then the ethical stuff, right? This is not a historical development.
Which would be the liberal capital L.
Right. So I think Hegel is doing himself a little bit of a disservice. And I will say, though, it's kind of weird here because that addition is going to be by one of his students who is taking notes. But you saw from the leading up to that addition about the heroes, Hegel is still kind of contrasting this right of heroes and a state of nature. So, like,
well, Moses is kind of, I don't know, embodies a little bit of that.
You know, I'm not exactly sure what Hegel has in mind with the state of heroes because it's like, it's almost a mythical time, right? It's the time of...
I mean, Moses would be kind of, well, yeah, I guess you're right. Yeah.
I mean, it's the time of bringing fire to man, right? This state of nature where you're conquering nature. It's not, we're in the state of nature and so men are killing each other. I said it's Hobbesian, but it's kind of not because the opposition is not men are wolf to man and are killing each other without any sort of apparatus to stop them. It's that there is literally a force brought to bear, but the important thing is a kind of domination of nature. It's almost the empiricism of Francis Bacon, not the artist, but the
right.
You know,
yeah, no, I got
thinker,
you. The English guy
who is kind of thinking about man's domination of nature is what allows for the establishment of scientific law. So it's not just a kind of tranquility of the transcendental whereby nature has to accord with our categories. And so in knowing ourselves better and our self-knowledge, we know nature better. No, it's like, no, we actually go out there and in mastering nature, we learn more about ourselves. It's almost, again, this is where empiricism and transcendentalism, for Deleuze, he tries to bring them together. That's going to take us outside of the scope of conversation.
I like it, though. It makes sense.
But it is a question
of,
like, where are we dominating? Are we mastering ourselves and therefore understanding ourselves better to master nature? I think for Bacon, it's like, no, but if that's true, for transcendental philosophy, we first had to have mastered nature in order to even begin this transcendental journey or continue it through, you know, this mastery of self-knowledge. So, you know, that's leaves us with a Hegelian aporia that we can pick up later.
And that will wrap up this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins.
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious character. The whole state of things, the pure violence without option anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is is the murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people as in Clockwork Orange.